For all verified facts, subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello and welcome. India's economy grew at 20.1% in the April to June 2021 period as compared to last year, which, if you remember rightly, was the lockdown year, where GDP, or gross domestic product, which reflects India's economic growth or any country's economic growth, contracted by around 24%. So there was a big jump, but also on the back of a contraction. So therefore, obviously, when numbers go down and then they go up again, the number appears larger. But let's try and understand what exactly is happening here. And more importantly, how does this number contrast, or where does it stack up against how the economy has been doing in the past? And indeed, the question could be, how is India's economy really doing? And who better to answer that question than a well-known economist, Shubhada Rao, and who is also now the founder of QuantEco Research and has worked as an economist with leading banks and financial institutions in the past. Shubhada, thank you very much for joining me. Congratulations on your new venture. And so maybe, and that's a good time to ask you, what really is happening in this economy? How should one interpret that 20% or 20.1% growth number?
First of all, it's a pleasure connecting with you, Govind, after quite some time. So I'm happy to be here with you. Coming to your question of should we be ecstatic about, this growth number of 20.1, while almost all the economists were anticipating anywhere between 18 to even 30% in some peripheral cases. The fact is that it was purely the harder you fall, the stronger the bounce looks. And that's exactly what happened. In a era where we are still grappling with uncertainties thanks to lockdowns, post-pandemic, during pandemic, I think it's always makes sense to look at sequential momentum rather than year on year, or what we call it as annualized growth, because last year, as you rightly pointed out, it was a lockdown year. The first quarter particularly was a complete freeze of economic activity. So obviously the corresponding period this year with more localized lockdowns and not nationwide lockdown was definitely expected to do much better, at least on the headline growth, and that's precisely what happened at 20.1. But as I said, if you map it sequentially, what we actually saw was economic activity slowed down or contracted by close to 17%. What it implies is that January-March quarter was significantly better than the April-June quarter, that is the first quarter of this fiscal year. Why was it so? Because we saw a very ferocious and devastating second wave of COVID, which of course did not culminate into a nationwide lockdown, but the cases were so widespread that many states and most states went through their phases of lockdown. So as a result, April-May was a very slow economic pace. We had an uneven kind of a performance. Manufacturing still did better because logistics were allowed, manufacturing activity was allowed. What obviously continued to lag is the services sector, particularly contact-intensive services. So there was an uneven form of even a sequential growth impetus that we saw in the recent past.
Right. And the other point, or the numerical point that people are comparing this to and would obviously like to know more about, is growth as it was before the pandemic. So for instance, and maybe let's keep the growth number, because that can always confuse, aside for a moment, and look at absolute numbers. So absolute numbers, GDP or total output, and maybe you can define it better for us, in 1920 was much higher than what it is today. So we are still 9.2% or close to 10% lower than what GDP was in that quarter before the pandemic. So now what does that mean? So because obviously pandemic has had a shock. Could we compare it with other countries? How do we know where we stand today? And have we been worse off with the pandemic? And maybe should we just be happy that we've at least recovered this much, and in coming quarters we'll go back to what we were before the pandemic?
Absolutely a great question, Govind, because, instead of getting euphoric about the 20% growth number, important to look at level of output. And that's exactly we have been doing, as to analyzing what has been the level of permanent scarring in terms of loss of output. And in this situation, what we estimate is, what if COVID had not happened, pandemic had not struck us, where the growth would have been compared to where we are today. So clearly there's a kind of a permanent scarring that Indian economy has seen, and not just Indian economy. I'll come to that shortly, but world over, most of the economies have actually seen permanent scarring of growth. How long is it going to take? In our opinion, yes, the recovery has begun to set in. To even reach the 2 years ago level of output, in our estimate, it would take us at least the third quarter of this fiscal year to just about make good of what we were, in 2019-20. So that is kind of the loss of output that we are seeing. And if the third wave is not as ferocious, or it does not really materialize, hopefully, it would actually help recovery process and healing process in the economy pick up at a faster pace. Not to forget, Govind, that vaccination forms the biggest form of stimulus, so to speak, in the economy. The quicker you vaccinate a larger segment of population, better it is to minimize the relative risk emanating from the economic fallout of these kind of pandemic situations. So clearly, it's going to take us a while. It has happened that a permanent scarring has taken place to the extent of about 8 to 10% of the, I'm not talking of the growth, I'm talking of the percent, shrinkage in terms of our level of output that we see.
Right, and we were just showing visuals of car makers and cars being manufactured, and clearly that's one sector which has taken a big hit. The entire hospitality sector, or anything involving contact, has also taken a big hit. So going forward, I mean, you did say that we should compare our absolute economic output and see where we stand today. But if you were to look at, given everything else about India and where we are today in contrast to where we were before COVID, does this give you hope that our future growth, and when I say future, I do mean immediate future, is going to be stronger and thus reflecting our inherent strengths, or do you suspect that we may have seen some permanent changes?
It's going to take us a while to get back to an 8% or 9% growth. 9, nobody's even going to dream of at this point in time. But it's going to take us at least 2 to 3 years to restore that kind of a recovery momentum. As I said, Govind, the recovery process is going to be very uneven. There are some sectors, consumer-facing sectors, which are still grappling with the pace of recovery, which still remains slow. Whereas on the other hand, there are some sectors which are actually turning around rather swiftly, be it rubber, plastics, chemicals, pharma. These are the kind of sectors which are actually looking better and are also poised to pick up fresh investment kind of appetite. So there is going to be unevenness in this recovery process, and India is not alone, as I said earlier. If we look at the entire COVID years of last 18 to 20 months, what we see is, perhaps with exception of China and Taiwan, where actually the growth had ticked in positive even in a COVID intense year, a lot of economies have gone through this recovery process, which has been uneven. Economies like US or even Korea within Asia or Indonesia, that have turned around fairly smartly, I would say, coming back to positive territory. But a larger segment of Asian economies still is grappling with a negative growth if we were to compare the COVID years. So India will be able to see a pace of recovery. Investments will be key. Government will have to take, once again, a leading role. Fortunately, keeping fiscal 21 behind, the first quarter government's capex has grown fairly smartly, I would say, at about 26-27%. Quality of expenditure of the government has been much better geared towards growth. So hopefully, private sector will begin to come in maybe in the third or fourth quarter, not immediately. So it's going to be very very critical to see investments, jobs all pick up at a decent pace over the next 3 to 4 quarters.
Right, and I'm going to come to jobs in a moment. But so what you're saying is, and if you can explain it to us a little more, that in downtimes like this, the government spends more, the economy stays propped up, and at some point the private sector will come in and start spending, maybe expanding investments in factories and new ventures, and then the economy gets a bigger shake-up. But the government's role is important at this point.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and that classic showcasing sector that I would, spell out is infrastructure. That is the place where government does and will have a ongoing role to play a dominant in a dominant space, so that they are able to attract private sector play in these infrastructure sectors. The recent announcement, the whole NMP in feeding into a lot of infrastructure sectors, that remains critical. Execution is going to be very important. We need to see a quick tact and so on. The PLIs, if I can call them, production linked incentive scheme, announced for about 12 to 13 sectors. We have seen that translate into positive impetus in areas like the mobile phones and so on. But the rest of the sectors also need to see expeditious execution, so that we are able to bring in foreign direct investment, attract domestic players into the investment space, and that itself will turn feed into the job increments that we extremely at this current point need to rev up.
Right, and we've just shown you some numbers alongside as you're speaking. It's a little technical, but let's ask the more fundamental question as we go ahead, Shubhada. So, according to you, we seem to agree that the economy has somewhat survived a very difficult period. We have not done as well as we could. But then this is where we are. How do things look ahead? You talked about jobs. Do you feel that the economy is likely to recover in a way that we can see more dynamism, more jobs, more fresh investment, more, let's say, mobility? We are seeing today people going back from factories to farms, which is a reversal of a very, very long trend, and therefore is not a good sign. But could all of this mean this bounce back be the beginning of something good as we look ahead?
I expect so, Govind, that perhaps the past we are well past the trough, whereas the economic recovery optimism was concerned. I think going forward, we are looking at a better pace of recovery. In coming to specifics of jobs, where are the jobs going to come in? We are seeing early trends of jobs coming back into services sector, be it logistics, be it retail, be it telecom. We are seeing pace getting far better compared to what the average used to be in the recent times. So jobs will grow. As I said, there's going to be an uneven process even in the job scenarios. There would be some sectors where the jobs may not get added as quickly, particularly, as I said, in hospitality, in more other contact intensive sectors, where we have seen fair bit of mortality and fair bit of consolidation also in the process. So we will see a slow recovery. But I'm not sure if people do track our DART index, which is an acronym for Daily Activity and Recovery Tracker. We have seen actually the index move up to almost 108, and we are seeing a 3 consecutive week pace of recovery. What we had seen in February of 21, that is a pre-second wave, we have seen all the losses getting recouped very swiftly starting June onwards, more so from July and August. As you rightly said, the mobility indicators and so on. So, Govind, we are still holding on to our own QuantEco forecast of 10%. And the reason being that all eyes, of course, on the October-December quarter, how much of festivities do help consumption get supported. There have been some government incentives through a dearness allowance and so on. If the jobs are gradually also showing some improvement, there will be confidence and consumer sentiment will continue to get better sequentially over the next 3 or 4 quarters. But as I said, are we behind the worst part? With a safe, bet, I can say perhaps we are. Of course, the usual in this scenario is we do not come across a third strong COVID wave, which some of them are expecting to hit by October.
Right, absolutely. Let's hope and pray for that. And of course, if that doesn't happen, then things look good, and the Indian economy is resilient, or has been resilient in the past, has shown signs of bouncing back, and hopefully will continue to do so. On that note, Shubhada Rao, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. Pleasure talking to you.